All righty, welcome everyone, and it's good to see a lot of familiar faces back from this morning. I know most of us are new acquaintances. Some of us have met a few times, but it's really just a pleasure and an honor to be with you guys. I felt like it was appropriate because I know a few weren't with us this morning to sort of just recap, and I'm going to do that ever so briefly, but just to let you know what that calling is something that I've given a lot of consideration to, never any more than when I'm here in Vancouver, because Vancouver is so foundational in many respects to my calling. I sort of illustrated this morning as we were talking about life is calling and life as calling, how that in all of our hearts, whether we articulate it in that way, there's a sense in which we want to understand what is that thing for which I'm designed? What is that calling, that vocation? Many times we'll refer to it as a vocation. And I've found that in my own life, calling is a sort of a series of revelations, if you will, sort of light shining on each step, on each next step. And we take a step of obedience, God reveals the next step for us, right? And so I shared with many of you how that growing up in southeastern Oklahoma, I was called to salvation, as I hope and pray all of you have been this evening, uh, that you were called to salvation and that you took that step of faith, and that after you took that step of faith, perhaps you've been wondering what the next step is. For me, it was discipleship and disciple making. And then, not long after that, through a youth ministry of a local church like this one that I was plugged into, I had the opportunity to respond to a calling to ministry. And I did that with fear and trembling. You remember Moses at the burning bush? That could have very well been me. I wanted to run the other direction. I'm the last person in the world who ever wanted to stand up in front of people and proceed to lead them in any sort of way. And so I did that in fear and trembling, took that step of responding to a calling to ministry, calling to salvation, calling to discipleship, calling to ministry. And that calling to ministry became a calling to prepare. And that kind of met me in my fear and trembling, right? This calling to prepare, knowing that we're not a finished product and that God has so much more in mind for us, and that in order to meet God in this calling that He has for us, that the best thing we can do is to prepare for that. And so we moved to North Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, where in the seminary classroom I was exposed to God's broader and grander plan for the nations. And we are all of the nations. We're all of some ethne, right? And so for me, my calling to ministry began to be a little bit more refined in the classroom. And I realized there's some aspect to which I'm called to the nations. And so I just spent several months with my wife praying through what that meant and exploring different possibilities. And God gave me this wonderful opportunity. I don't know that I saw it as a wonderful opportunity at the time, because she lost her very lucrative job and I was a full-time student. And so I had to become a part-time student at night while I was working in laundromats repairing appliances in the Texas heat. And so, in working in Dallas Fort Worth, visiting 35 odd different laundromats, I would go in and repair appliances and, of course, have conversations with people. And I began to realize, wow, the nations are here. But where are the churches to reach these nations? And so my calling to ministry became a calling to the nations, and that became a calling to the nations in North American cities. And ultimately, God burdened my heart through someone some of you might have met, Dan Crawford, helped to refine that calling even more. Professor Dan Crawford helped me to refine that calling even more, to see that there was a calling for me to start churches, start new churches to reach the nations living in North American cities. And so that became really the subsequent steps of my calling as God revealed it. And it seems so intuitive looking back on it, right? But in the time, in any moment in which we find ourselves when we're wondering what the next step may be, it can be sort of a burning bush kind of thing, right? Sort of frightening. Perhaps you're in a new home, a new place, a new circumstance, a new season of life, and calling for you might be just be sort of a question of, wow, I've never been at this place in my life. I've never been a graduated student. I've never lived in another country. I've never been in this season of life in which I find myself. And so calling can be a scary proposition. But what I've found in looking back, and I hope that what you can see even through this process today, is sort of reflecting back, as Israel often did in the scriptures, reflecting back upon God's faithfulness to lead them, that you can begin to see sort of an intuitive pattern of calling and leading that will hopefully shine some light on your next steps. This morning we looked at the life of Jeremiah, and we're not going to revisit that. It was quite the survey. We covered a lot of territory, but what I did do was I attached some of the scriptures that we used to trace Jeremiah's his sort of discovery of calling throughout the book of Jeremiah. This morning I've attached these to some of the same points that I laid the groundwork for in sharing with you this morning. And I want to sort of even start maybe a step further back from where we began this morning. We're going to cover those same 5 areas that we did and allude to the arrow and how the calling of our life is like an arrow. But you know, this morning, one of the things that I also alluded to, and I think you'll find that this is very true, when you examine the biblical narrative and you look at the lives of people like Abraham and Moses and Ruth and Mary and Peter and Paul and the apostles, you can do exactly what I did with Jeremiah this morning. You can see how God led them each step of the way as he revealed the next aspect of their callings. And so I take a lot of comfort and encouragement from this, realizing that these were real people that God met in their season and their time. He even says in Ruth that she's called for such a time as this, right? And so for each of us to recognize our gifting and our passion, our calling, and our moment for serving can help give a lot of purpose and power, really, to the direction of our lives. So a couple of quick notes, if I could, in an effort to maximize the value of this very abbreviated time tonight, right? We have a very abbreviated time. I'm going to do very little of this directive teaching. I did a lot of that this morning. I really want this to be a somewhat interactive time, but it's really going to be a reflective time. And so you're going to need a little bit of workspace. You have a handout there in front of you. But I want you to understand that we're going to merely highlight a number of points for personal application. And then secondly, you were asked, I believe, to do a couple of free inventories, an APEST sort of inventory, and then a SHAPE inventory, which included spiritual gifts and passions and experiences and that sort of thing. Someone has asked, did I want to see those? I don't need to see those. That's for you. But hopefully what we can kind of do tonight is in this handout, hang on to this handout, because what I'd like for you to do is to begin to sort of aggregate all of those different learnings and to make a few notes on this sheet. And then at a time in the future, what I really, really hope that all of you will do is to schedule a follow-up conversation with Pastor Garrett to begin to kind of pray together and to look at implications of your story for how God might be leading you in the next steps of discovering your calling. And so again, as I shared this morning, I'm going to use some of my own story to sort of illustrate how that calling can be modeled and the value of calling can be modeled. I kind of stopped with my story in Fort Worth, right? But the next step for me was actually taking the step of testing that calling by coming here to British Columbia and spending the time on the North Shore of Vancouver, and had the opportunity to meet Ray for the first time, and Jim Graham, who was here this morning for the first time, and some others whose very might have seemed casual touches in the whirlwind of a summer, the whirlwind of an internship, whose touches really sort of reassured me of calling and helped to nudge me in the right direction. Now, one of the things that I really felt strongly at the time, we were so drawn in this formative season of calling to British Columbia, to Vancouver, Metro Vancouver, and to all that God was doing here. At the time, I remember I would walk with a person of peace from South Africa who had come here after apartheid. We had a member in our core group on the North Shore of a church that we were working with who was Bosnian. She was a Bosnian refugee. and she had come right after the conflict in her country. And, so there are always these rhythms in cities and places where people gather that are churning up gospel opportunity for us to meet. And so we experienced that in British Columbia, and God gripped. I keep saying British Columbia. Uh, of course, we're in British Columbia. I mean, Metro Vancouver. Um, God used that to really grip our hearts for this area. And it's a burden that's always continued and that's endured. And so it's a real honor and privilege to be here. But in the midst of all of that, something completely unexpected happened. God directed us not to the Pacific Northwest, but to the northeastern United States. And so that's where we have lived out our calling. But many of the things that we learned about calling and the insights that we gained about how to continue to pursue God's calling, that groundwork was laid here. And so this is a special place for me. This church and your home is a special place for me. You're on our hearts and in our thoughts, and so we pray for you. And one of my prayers for the days to come is going to be that you just continue to take steps of discovery in God's calling on your lives. And so a couple things, and I'll reiterate. You should, I hope, reserve time for reflecting more deeply on the things that we're going to cover very superficially tonight. We have such a short time together and such a profound topic to cover. And so you should schedule time to reflect more deeply. And so I hope you'll capture some impressions to sort of take with you tonight. But you should also schedule time to meet with Pastor Garrett and debrief what God puts on your heart. Okay? And if you're not from this church, meet with a pastor here. Meet with Pastor Ray. I believe our Egyptian friend is a pastor. I don't remember your name. Forgive me. Raphat. And so, there are people that God's put in your path and in your life that you can meet with to sort of debrief these things. But I know God put this whole conversation on Pastor Garrett's heart, so I urge you to compare your impressions with him. So, again, as you are finishing your digestion this morning or this evening, I want to direct your attention back to this metaphor of the arrow, this sort of word picture that we're going to use. This is actually from, this is no longer copywritten material, by the way. This is not my copywritten material. It never was, but it's from an organization called Unique, Y-O-U, Unique. And they recently made this open source and free to those of us who are certified to share openly. And so I'll share this information with Pastor Garrett, but this is an illustration that I found extremely helpful that I shared with you guys this morning, and that I sort of used different passages from Jeremiah's life to model even how Jeremiah pursued and discovered his calling. Again, I think you could do this for Ruth, for Moses, for several biblical characters, and we can sort of see how they have modeled this pathway for us. We're going to cover about 6 areas tonight really quickly, and these are 5 of them. I can count, right? 5, but there's one other that I want to allude to. And you can see this is really like a 6-session sort of training, and we're going to cover it in 90 minutes. And so we're going to move rather quickly, but I wanted to remind you this morning that as we think about our story, one of the things that we were drawn to is this whole thing of the passion funnel by Dr. Howard Hendricks. We're going to come back to this, just this whole question of passion. But I just wanted to kind of remind you, there are several things that you can do in life and glorify God. Just because you don't maybe discover precisely what it is that God's called you to do in this short session or in the next short season of your life, there are several things that you can do. And I believe several of those things could be things that would glorify God. But as Hendricks taught, and as I believe we see in Scripture so often, as we seek to refine our calling and to better understand how God's divinely designed us, what we so often will come to is sort of a bottom line understanding of what that is that we must do. And he characterized this as passion. So we're going to talk about this evening these areas, 5 steps to discover your God-given purpose: my story, my gifting, my passion, my calling, and my goal. But this evening, I'm going to keep saying that, right? This morning, I want to start with God's story. This morning, we didn't really allude to God's story, and I've included that in your handout, just an allusion to that at the top of your page this morning. I'm going to keep doing that, saying this morning, but this evening. So one of the things that I want us to acknowledge is that God's overarching story is sort of a, maybe you've heard the term meta-narrative. It's sort of the historical story that we all believe in faith. And I wonder if you've noticed what a story-driven culture we live in. How many of you this past week have read a book or watched a movie or watched a series on Netflix? Maybe you've watched a reality series. My wife and I like the one Survivor, where people are dropped into the wilderness, and and there's a competition to see who can get to the end, be the sole survivor. One of the things in so many reality series that they've begun doing is they'll kind of zoom into people's lives and they'll tell their stories. And you see this in sports as well, right? So many times there'll be like a sports team, and they'll have a journalistic reporter who will interview a character an athlete that will help us to know whether it's a reality show or whether it's an athlete, that this is a real person with a real life, with real stories and struggles and triumphs, right? And we're drawn to that, right? And it seems like the more they've done that, the more there's an appetite for it. We're drawn in by stories, and we live in a story-driven culture. And I think this is very much a part of our wiring, because we know that we're a part of a larger story. We know that God has a purpose and a plan, whether we articulate it in those terms or not. We know that we were designed for a purpose, and so we have a hunger. We're drawn forward with a need to understand what that purpose is, so that our lives are not wasted, right? So that our lives are not spent in an unworthy sort of way. And so for every believer and disciple of Jesus, it's important that we start with God's overarching story, and to realize that the most God-honoring thing we can do is to locate our story within His story and see how our story and how He's designed us can serve His greater story, His grander story, the overarching meta-narrative. You know, you've probably heard that in Scripture, that meta-narrative can be described as creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. This is what we see from Genesis to Revelation, right? We see this kind of winding road from God's creation of man in the Garden of Eden, to man's fall, to the many attempts to redeem man, and finally seeing that happen in Christ, and then the restoration of all things that we long for when Christ will come again. And so God's story is the backdrop of our own stories. And I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that, because this helps us determine the bullseye in our lives, right? It helps us determine how we will participate with God by living in His story, by living out our stories. There's a quote right below that first paragraph on God's story that says, "A leader's vision," read this with me, "a leader's vision is a clear mental image of a preferable future imparted by God to His chosen servants to advance His kingdom, and it's based on an accurate understanding of God, self, and circumstances." I first read this in a book by George Barna. I don't know, it must have been 25, 30 years ago. But it's resonated as true all of these years for me, and it's a loaded phrase. There's so many important words there, words and phrases: preferable future, clear mental image, right? God's chosen servants. But I want to direct your attention to the last three things that he says there. It's based upon an accurate understanding of God, self, and circumstances. This is part of why we start with the meta-narrative of God and acknowledging His sovereignty over all of creation, His sovereignty over our stories, right? And then how we hopefully tonight will begin to just sort of stir up your thinkings and your reflections on what it means to clearly and accurately understand ourselves and our own stories, and then to look at our circumstances and discover the opportunities that He's placed before us to live out our calling. All right, you with me so far? I'm going to be competing with the food that's digesting in your bellies before long. Again, we'll refer again and again to the arrow, but we're going to kind of take these in a little different order than we did this morning. I was taking Jeremiah's story chronologically to sort of illustrate how God revealed calling in his life. But I'd like to start with the shaft of the arrow, which is the story part of each and every one of us in our callings, right? The story part is the part for every one of us. You know, you might look at this and you might say, "Oh, Pastor Steve, I don't know if I'm gifted." You might say, "Pastor Steve, I don't know what I'm passionate about." You might say, "Pastor Steve, I have no idea what my goal or my calling is." But all of us can look at this and say, "I have a story," right? We can all say, "I have a story." Maybe you wouldn't tell your story the way I told mine just a few moments ago, but you can look back and you can see formative events in your life, whether positive or negative, right? And we're going to dive into those here in just a few moments. By the way, when you look at this arrow, you can begin to fill in some of those blanks. Your story is that structural part of the arrow. We're going to analogize it to that structural part of the arrow to which all of the other components are attached, right? We have the nock, we have the fletchings, we have the arrowhead, and here is the shaft, or the story of our calling that's connecting all of these things. And so your story is that structural part. It's the shaft of the arrow. Your gifting is this arrow notch, this nock, right, that we talked about this morning. Because even though God divinely designs us and gifts us, it's His power that propels us, right? It's the acknowledgement that as His followers, it's His power, the power of the string in the hand of the archer who wields the bow that hurls our lives and towards in the direction of our callings, towards a God glorifying goal. So the gifting is the nock, N-O-C-K. Your passion, as we said, is the fletchings this morning. That helps the arrow fly in the direction it's intended to go, right? Towards its intended goal. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to fly a paper airplane, or maybe you have had some practice with archery, and if you have damaged fletchings or if they're bent or something, the arrow doesn't fly in the direction it's supposed to, does it? And without fletchings, the arrow would just dive down or make a hard right turn and wound the person sitting next to us. The fletchings direct us in the right manner and help us to fly straight towards the goal. We talked about that this morning. And then calling, we said, is the primary functional part of the arrow. An arrow without an arrowhead is not an arrow, is it? And a calling without a point of impact is not a calling. And so calling is that primary functional part. It's the arrowhead. And then the goal is the target, right? It's the bullseye for which we're striving. And that's the best understanding that we can arrive at of God's purpose and plan and design in our lives. And so the story, again, this is what we're talking about in this first part. It connects all of those different parts of our being so that we can participate in God's larger story and hit His bullseye for our lives. Here's where I want to apply. This is how we're going to spend the majority of our time together tonight. I want to say, by the way, I should have offered this on the front end. If you have questions, I want to encourage you to write your questions down, okay? If we have some time, we'll address those towards the end of our time together, or you can address those in your conversations with Pastor Garrett when you schedule your follow-up interview. Well, we're not going to have a lot of time for interaction, and this is me trying to be considerate of your time. But what I do encourage you to do is to use this time and as you might as if you're taking an exam, okay? That puts a really negative light on this. That's not really how I want to do that. It's not as though it's as though you're sketching a beautiful piece of art, right? It's not usually a collaborative thing, and you're not usually you're not doing it with the people sitting around you. It's you're focused in, and you're trying to sketch out this picture maybe that you're observing in a quiet, peaceful moment. So I'm hoping that this may be sort of a quiet, peaceful moment, and that you can kind of focus in tonight with the space that we're giving you to reflect on these things. So here's what I'd like for us to do. I'd like for you to engage in an exercise that begins with hinge moments. Hinge moments. You heard me talk in my story just a little bit earlier about the different ways that I recognized God's calling in my life. If I were to go more into the weeds, and I'll model this for you in just a second. If I were to go more into the weeds for you, you'll see my example on your handout there. That would include not just high points, but hard times, right? How many of us have hard times in our lives? Right, we all do. We all have hard times. And so, what I'd like for you to spend the next several moments doing, and we'll take 5, 6 minutes, because this is just something that will begin. Um, but as I look at the high points of my life, these are the times when I recognized God's hand at work and when I felt God's affirmation or the affirmation of those around me. The hard times are those character building times, right? Those times where maybe things aren't as clear and where they require faith and belief to kind of press through. And so every hinge moment can either be a high point or a hard time, but all of those things make us who we are. And so, what I've begun to do there, as I've modeled on your handout, what I want to encourage you to go ahead and begin doing this right now, is to list some of the high points in your life, some of those moments that have made you who you are. Okay? And so, for many of us, it might be the kind of home you grew up in, might have been a positive. For me, salvation was a big, big thing, as I hope it is for all of us. I was married at a very young age, at a crazy young age 19, right? That was a high point in my life. A hard time in my life was the death of my mother, the death of my father, the death of a sister, the emotional struggles of a daughter, right, who went through a suicidal season. And then a crisis of faith because of some difficulties in working relationships, right? And so I want to direct you in this moment. Again, we'll give you 5 or 6 moments of, maybe we can even play some music. I don't know whether you have that ready. I didn't give you any warning. But just go ahead and brainstorm some high points and some hard times and list those in the respective areas on your handout. And then my next instruction will come in another 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll tell you what we're going to do with those. But we're trying to understand your story, and this is one of the building blocks for understanding your story. Okay, go ahead. If you have a question, wave a hand, and I'll come over to you. I'll encourage you as you get about 8 to 10 of these that you can start kind of trying to group some of them together into seasons of your life. You can see that my salvation occurred at age 10. I was married at age 19. My parents were saved not long after I was. So that was sort of I look at that as sort of a chapter of my life. And so if you get 8 to 10 or more of these and you want to sort of group them, what I'd like for you to kind of arrive at is 6 chapters in this. And they may be largely, you may have more high points than you do hard times. You may have more hard times than you do high points. But try to distill it down to or group it together into about 6 chapters. So as you continue to do that, take another minute and then I'll give some more instructions. So I'm going to give you your next instruction. You'll see in your handout that you have a full page devoted to what I've entitled a 6-sketch storyboard. Okay, a 6-sketch storyboard. What I want to encourage you to do, and there's so much value in this, I cannot stress to you how powerful and profound this can be to reflect back upon your story. And so what I encourage you to do is to take these high points and hard times, and again, to try and arrive at 6 of these, and then transfer them in graphic form to this 6-sketch storyboard. Now, of course, this is just a rough draft. You can begin here, but you can continue this at home, and I really encourage you to do this. This can be such a powerful thing. I want to illustrate for you how recently, and I was able to draft my own 6-sketch storyboard that helped me to understand and see God's fingerprints of direction in my life. And I'll tell you right off that I didn't follow this. I didn't go 1, 2, 3. I went 1, 2, 3. I don't follow instructions very well. And so if you don't either, then there's grace at the foot of the cross, okay? So this 6-sketch storyboard for me. Let me tell you my story here just really, really quickly. I told you a little bit earlier so that I can include aspects of my calling. I had a honeymoon season, a honeymoon days of my life, which sort of represent the sprouting of my life. And I mentioned to you that I grew up in Oklahoma in the home of parents who were not believers, prayed to receive Christ, and they also came to Christ. Met my high school sweetheart who was also a committed Christian, and her parents were influential in my life in helping draw me back in a season of rebellion that led me to prepare for ministry in Texas. This is Southwestern Seminary, by the way, Ray. Maybe you recognize the dome. So I sort of had this honeymoon sprouting season. And this was probably about the first 20 years of my life, 24 years of my life. This second season was building upon sprouting, was a sort of formation or fruit-bearing season. And this was more that season that I described, where it seemed like each day, each year was sort of God's progressive revelation of the next step of my calling. And this was a time that continued probably over the next from about 24, 25, probably into my mid-30s, in which God called me to the nations, called me to North American cities. In fact, called me to church planting. You see there that my family and I are casting seeds, and churches are resulting, and disciples are going forward. But there were also seasons of hardship in my life. And this isn't chronologically exactly how it would occur, but there was this really big bump in the road. Have you ever felt like that? Like there's just this ditch and you've just fallen into it, or this big bump in the road. And so I recognized in my life, I'd gone through these sprouting days, through these formation days. In fact, I said this was like being a seedling, right? And this was being like a fruit tree bearing fruit. Well, for me, the next chapter I entitled Loss and Hardship, because it was sort of a season of cultivation. And cultivation isn't always fun, right? It's digging. I had a missionary friend that Ray would know, who used to say that cultivation is digging and dunging, right? If you want something to grow, many times you put dung on it. You stir up the ground, you break up the hard ground, right? You put dung on it. This was a difficult season for me. I lost my father. I went through my wife went through a season of breast cancer, which not only really changed her health and her identity in so many ways and impacted our marriage and our family, but it led us into severe indebtedness, right? And so it was kind of a protracted season of 10, 12 years where we went through loss and hardship. But I look back on this now and I see that this was a season of cultivation. God wasn't distant from us in that season, even though what we were going through was difficult. The next season was sort of a calling convergence for me, and I describe this as harvesting. Again, there was this occurrence of calling that was sort of a burning bush sort of thing for me, in which God said, drop everything you're doing and move from Western New York. So maybe some of you recognize Niagara Falls down near Toronto. That's where we were ministering. And God said, I'm calling you to the Big Apple, to New York City, to plant churches and to be involved in a larger work that would indeed engage the nations. And so this was sort of a season of calling convergence. All of those little callings that I described earlier in our lives led us to New York and led us to have an opportunity, an outlet for living out that calling in a global arena. And then the next season, we're getting more and more recent, right? Because I'm not 100 years old. I'm much older than most of you, but I'm not 100 years old, right? And so, you can kind of see that we've got to be getting close to my current season of life. There was this crisis of faith season. And this was a season in which we had teenagers and young adults in our family. And my daughter had severe emotional trauma and struggles, and even still today suffers from some physical effects of that. This was a season of pruning. It was another difficult season in a lot of ways, right? Maybe as you read, and you can probably see, if you're familiar with John chapter 15, maybe you kind of see the reflection of John chapter 15 in here, because I was the branch that was seeking to abide in the Lord, but along the way there was difficulty, there was pruning, and pruning can't be fun for a tree, right? But what happens when you're pruned? More growth results, healthy growth results. My wife is the primary barber in our family. And sometimes she'll tell my kids that it's time for them to have a haircut, and they don't even realize it, because the ends will become frayed of their hair. And so she'll cut their hair so that it's healthy, right? There's pruning that takes place. I had a difficult supervisor who really caused me to question whether I was still in God's will, whether I was really still where God had called me to be. And I lost a sister and a mom in that season as well. And so that season for me didn't just automatically lead to the next season, but when I was led through this process, and I want to illustrate for you just how profound I think this whole discovering your story and being able to look for God's fingerprints in your story. It was really in this chapter, this very recent chapter, that I went through this process of calling discovery with a unique organization. And I realized that God wasn't done with me yet, that there was another chapter yet. And so through this season of pruning, just as we see in the book of John chapter 15, uh, that what comes after pruning is much fruit bearing. And so this is going from a fruit bearing tree and seeing a harvest to participating in a legacy, an orchard being sprung up. And this was in New York City as well, but it's seeing the churches that I've helped to start other churches. It's seeing those that I've discipled lead others by discipling those that they lead to Christ. And so for me, this is an exciting season, and I won't dwell on this much, but this is sort of the season that this process led me to anticipate that God wasn't done with me yet. And he led me to John 15, and he helped me to see that this next chapter of my story was going to be the most powerful yet by faith. And we're even beginning to see the initial fruits of that, even as we step forward into what God has for us next. And so what I want you to do, again, and I probably took several minutes to do this, but I want you to, in the days to come, and maybe you can even begin kind of sketching this out, grab some of your hinge moments, your high points and your hard times, and begin to plug them into these different chapters. Make it sort of a chronological thing, right? Because I think in your handout it goes down, 1, 2, 3. Put them in whatever order that you want. But what we want you to begin to see is that God's fingerprints are all throughout this process of high points and hard times. And again, I didn't start with the understanding that I was living John 15 and that I was seeking to abide in God. You know, I entitled my 6-sketch storyboard, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. An effort to abide, helped me see that I was experiencing a lot of what John and Jesus through John told me as a disciple that I would experience, and that there was glory for God and fulfillment for us in the days to come. And so again, here's where I want to leave you. I want to encourage you. So take your hinge moments that you recorded, group some of them together into chapters, and then begin to just make some sketches. This is just for you, by the way. You're not going to stand up and have to put it on the screen here. I'm actually leading a cohort where we did ask them to do that. But sketch them out, give them a chapter, okay? Give these a chapter. And then what I'd like to really encourage you to do, we'll take just another couple moments for you to start this tonight. Give your storyboard a 6-word title, and then take this when you meet with Pastor Garrett and share with him what God reveals to you about your story and what you think your next chapter might be. Okay? So I know this is really, really, really moving fast, but does everyone kind of get what I'm illustrating here, what I'm encouraging you to do? Okay, yes, ma'am. I think it should be whatever you want it to be. But I think this is a good, manageable sort of piece. And in order to come up with 6, I sort of had to group some things together. But no, ma'am, I would say if you want to take a blank sheet and make yours 8 chapters or 4 chapters, however best helps you articulate your story. That's the important part. Good question. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Actually, I'll give you a few more moments. Just to work on your own 6-sketch storyboard. And then we're going to move on from story and talk about gifting. By the way, this was a long process for me. I didn't do all of this on one draft. I had a journal with many, many, many efforts to kind of capture what I saw as God's hand playing out in my life through the hinge moments, the high points, and the hard times. So don't feel too much pressure to get it right on your first draft. And in my illustration, rather than creating more chapters than 6, you can see I just sort of grouped rather than doing one image for each chapter. So you can do it any way that you want. But give your chapter a name and then give your storyboard a name. And maybe what you can accomplish during this time, maybe you want to come up with a graphic, or maybe you just come up with a title for that chapter, and then later you go back and you fill in the graphic. Part of the reason I put my own graphic up here is so that you guys wouldn't feel so self-conscious about your art. You can see how crummy mine is. But it illustrates effectively for me. Okay. So let's talk about the next aspect of calling, and that is gifting. And as we look at the arrow, remember we talked this morning about gifting being the notch, right? Remember when we were thinking about Jeremiah this morning, we talked about how that God told him in the first chapter, before uh, before you were conceived, I knew you. I knit you together. Um, I called you out. Your calling, the calling that God had on Jeremiah's life, was present before, as we like to say sometimes, before even Jeremiah was a gleam in his mother's eye, right? Even before there was any evidence of pregnancy, God had foreordained that Jeremiah would live. And so God designed him and gifted him. And again, this is the plastic tip that's connected to the arrow. It's what makes it fly. This is not a concept that's foreign to us, right? In any arena of life. And again, I don't know how it's done here in Canada. I know in the US, in educational circles, you'll take temperament inventories. When you go to work for a company, many times you'll go through an HR sort of process where they'll want to understand some things about your temperament, hopefully to put you in the best environment to thrive and add value to the organization that you're connected with. But this aspect of gifting, again, it's what gives the arrow the opportunity to fly powerfully in the hands of the great archer. And it's interesting that it's a notch, right? Because you think of gifting as something that should stand out, right? But gifting is really sort of the way that we receive the power from God. And you all were encouraged to do some free inventories. There are many, many inventories. Brother Ray and I were talking before you all arrived about how that he has on file, and I do too, all of these different inventories that I've taken through the years, whether it's the Myers-Briggs or the Ministry Insights or the Clifton Strengths Finder or the Golden, or the DISC maybe you've heard of. And so there's nothing magical about the ones that I've chosen for you to look at tonight. Actually not tonight, but that I encourage you to do in advance, or that you can do after you leave if you haven't done these. Those are for your purposes. Here's what I'd like to encourage you to do, and we're going to take a very few moments for this, but your APEST or your fivefold ministry type, if you did that inventory, it should have explained for you, given you some description, just a little bit of a description of what these stand for. In Ephesians chapter 4, we're told that God gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be shepherds, and some to be teachers. And so as we think about how God has pre-purposed us to fulfill his will in community, right? One of the great things about gifting is it's not to distinguish us or cause us to stand out, but it's, as Scripture makes very clear, 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 and other passages, Ephesians 4, Paul says these things are expressed most powerfully in community where we complement one another, right? And in fact, he says in Ephesians chapter 4 that when we express our gifting, these apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, when we express these things in community, we complement one another in such a way that we wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, O-L-L-Y, right, that we together and comprehensively and wholly make up the completeness that is the body of Christ. And so, again, this is a quick description, but you have a more thorough description in the inventory that you took. The apostles extend the gospel. And these are very churchy words, right? You look at these words and you think, oh, this doesn't apply to me at all. But let me just help you to see that the word apostles, as they're used in churches like this one, Baptist churches, are not speaking of the 12 capital A apostles, Jesus' first original followers. It's talking about those who extend the gospel through ministry outside the church into places where the gospel doesn't exist yet. In New York City, we seek to start churches every place where gospel access, new or unique gospel access is needed. And so apostle, that's the work of apostles, little a, apostles, right? Prophets, again, are are not people that we typically think walk around and live and breathe today, right? Or if they are, we think they're kind of cuckoo, right? We think they're the crazy uncles. But the prophets are the ones who just seem to have a keen insight into God's will and who sort of receive vision from the Lord. And even as we talked about with Jeremiah this morning, whether it's in a difficult time or in a positive way, who direct the body of Christ forward. And so I sometimes think of prophets as those who speak out against things like social injustice, or who not just have a passion, because we all have passions, right? But prophets have a way, people with this prophetic gift have a way of communicating God's heart for a community of faith. And so a prophet, a person who's expressing the gift of prophet through Towers Baptist Church might see an initiative in the community that needs to be engaged, and they speak to it in a way that mobilizes this church to engage that gospel opportunity. Evangelists, that's probably the most self-evident, right? You know, evangelist, the word literally in the Greek means good news. And so evangelists like Pastor Garrett, if you walk around, spend some time with Pastor Garrett if you want to know what an evangelist is sometime. He won't go to a coffee house. You know, he likes coffee. I've never seen him go to a coffee house and not strike up a conversation with a stranger. And the stranger respond very favorably to him. If I speak to a stranger, they're going to say, you know, and maybe this is just New York, but I just don't seem to have the gift that my brother has in speaking to people sometimes. Now, we all have the opportunity and the responsibility to share the good news, but evangelists just have this sort of gift for enlisting people, right? Enlisting people and drawing people in with this good news. Shepherds are like, another word for shepherd is pastor. They nurture and they protect. I don't want you to think so much about titles with these, okay? Let's kind of diffuse that idea as you look at your APEST inventory. Think more as functions of the church. There's a shepherding function of the church. And really and truly, in a sense that doesn't apply to roles, this is male or female. It could be those who nurture and protect the life of the church and who strengthen the life of the church through nurturing and protecting. Teachers, obviously, again, that's a role that we understand, or that we realize and see. They understand and they explain things in a way that others can understand. Okay? So here's what I want to encourage you to do. And maybe you already see this in your handout. You have some prompts there to think through. As you look at your inventory, the sheets of the inventory, hopefully you printed it out and you brought it, or you can take this back and kind of overlay it with your handout. But I'd like for you to, and I want to encourage you to go through and to read every word on the pages of that inventory. And do this, okay? You're not a type, and you're not the result of an inventory. You are you, okay? Inventories are tools to help us understand things about ourselves. So go through your APEST inventory, and if something really seems true of you, then circle it, okay? If you read something, you say, that's true of me. I'm a person who's skilled at enlisting people, recruiting people. Then circle that. If you go on down and you see something and you say, wow, that's not true of me, just draw a line through it. That's a tool for you to better understand and to refine your understanding of what your gifting might be. And maybe you even put a star by something. You say, that's very true of me. Yes? Okay. Did anyone not receive that email about those inventories from Pastor Garrett? Okay. All right. Please let Pastor Garrett know. These are free inventories. There are others that maybe you've taken that weren't necessarily free, but that you've done in the course of your job or your education. Do the same thing. Go through those. You're not a type. You're not an ENTJ. You're not a type A. You're not a high D. But those things, sometimes we speak in those terms, but those inventories shed light on kind of our predisposition and maybe even how God's wired us, okay? So as you look at your APEST inventories, here's some questions for you to consider, and you can capture these later. But what as you look through your inventory results, what's surprising to you? What's confusing to you about it? What's true? What's not true? You are the ultimate validator of what's true, okay? Prayerfully consider how pursuing the gifting that God reveals through that inventory, prayerfully consider how pursuing that might look in your home, in your workplace, in your classroom, in your neighborhood, in your church. And I also like to say season of life, because you look around the room, we're all at different seasons of life, right? Some of us are just finishing education, just starting out in our vocational careers. Maybe some of you are newly married or have a first child. Maybe some of you are further along in living out your calling, like some of the rest of us. And so also do the same thing with your shape. Now, this again is an acronym, right? SHAPE, which talks about spiritual gifts, talents, abilities. And so go through that and circle. What are the things that inventory reveals to you about your identity and about your unique gifting? Circle them if you believe they're true. Draw a line through them if you question whether they're, or draw a line through them if you feel like they're not true. Put a question mark if you're not sure, and then ask some people around you, do you see this in me? Right? Again, this can be a powerful sort of lens to train upon our self-reflection. And then ask yourself the implication questions, the so what questions. How might living these out look in your home, in your workplace, in your classroom, in your neighborhood, in your season of life, or your church? And we're going to give you some places to capture these. But the first part is just kind of sifting so that these things come to the surface, right? Because so many times we just live our lives. Our lives are like right here, right? Like our lives are like right at the end of our nose, so that we don't even we can't even see, and we don't even distinguish our identity and our temperament and our habits and our demeanor, right? Because it's like right here. We just go through life, and sometimes just pulling back, right? And taking the time to sort of figuratively look in the mirror of gifting, we can begin to notice some things about how God has predisposed us. All right, I'm going to keep moving. We good so far? Okay. So I know I'm competing with the food in your bellies. So your passion was the next thing we talked about, and this is the fletchings of the arrow. For me, this was another very powerful part of this process in understanding what God was doing in my heart and my life in the different high points and hard times. And it was realizing that throughout these different things, that God was, that I could always identify passions that God had given me. I'm going to illustrate this here in just a second. Jeremiah talked about it this morning. We visited those passages of scripture where Jeremiah talked about it in chapter 29. He said this was like a fire in his bones, right? Something he could not do, and something that was worth suffering. Jeremiah suffered in pursuing his passion. And so the question of passion, the answer to the question of passion is what, there's going to be suffering in your life. What is worth suffering for, right? Giving birth to a child. That's worth suffering for, right? And so when you think about passion in this arrow metaphor are those feathers, those fins on the back of the arrow that keep it flying in a straight direction towards its target. Let me illustrate for you. My daughter was going through a hard time as I went into this process. I told you I was kind of in chapter 5 of my storyboard, and it wasn't as though there were certainly good things happening as well. But it was a hard time for me because I was feeling a lot of hurt for my daughter. I was grieving for my daughter's difficulties. And it was in this season during COVID, right? A lot of this was happening during COVID. And I know in the people that I relate to sometimes refer to COVID as sort of an amplifier. COVID was an amplifier for me. We spent a lot of time at home. Maybe you did as well, working from home. And so my hands did not know what to do. And so, I would get my work done banging on the computer. I would think till my head hurt. And then, but I felt so powerless to fix what was wrong in my daughter's life. And that grieved me, right? And I felt powerless to change the lostness that was happening out in my community because we weren't allowed to be out in our communities. So you know what I did? And this sounds so mundane, uh, but what I did was I tore up our bathroom and I completely remodeled our bathroom. And so we're going in, and so you're thinking, wait, what? Uh, so as I was going through this process, a few months after COVID, one of the things I realized was, you know what? I see potential in things, or I see brokenness, and I want to fix it. That's a passion that I have, right? And if I can't fix something out there, or if I can't repair the brokenness that's in my daughter's life, I'll find something where I can affect some change, help some potential to be realized. One of the things I realized about the passion in my life was the thing that grieved me most is unrealized potential, right? Unrealized potential. And so this took a lot of reflection, but it was such a revelation for me in this process. And passion can be a powerful, powerful thing, right? Especially when when we see evidences of that in our lives. And so look at the things in your life. And I've given you a couple of exercises here to help you identify the passions in your life. And again, there are probably other ways to discover this. Maybe you know instantly what your passions are, right? But here are a couple of exercises for you see in your handout. One is called offender opposites. Offender opposites. And so I'll tell you that living and working in the New York City metro, I have to drive a lot. And New Jersey drivers are generally very angry, aggressive drivers. I am a New Jersey driver. I'm not always angry and aggressive, but I have to. I fit the profile. I have to drive amongst people who are very angry and aggressive, and uh, and sometimes the thing that frustrates me when I'm trying to get somewhere is people driving slowly. Right? Apologies to those of you who like to drive below the speed limit, um, but uh, but I want to drive at least the speed limit, right? And so, see, this is not a good thing. But one of the things I realize about myself is that when I look at what offends you, okay, and it might be a very fleshly thing. What do you find that offends you? You want to know what your passion is? Find what offends you or wounds you. And so for me, and this was the most tongue-in-cheek sort of thing I could find. People driving slowly sort of offends me, and so think about what the opposite of that thing is, and you might reveal a passion. So for me, people driving slowly, the one word way of summarizing what that is it's impedance, it's obstruction, right? And the opposite of that for me is my passion. It's progress, it's development, right? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So take just a few moments and jot down some of your offender opposites. And listen, it could be somebody being rude to you. And so, what's the one word summary of someone being rude to you or not serving you well or whatever? It could be the loss of relationship, might be the opposite of that, the loss of opportunity for relationship. Um, so, jot down some of your offenders, and maybe you don't even know what the opposite of it is in this moment. But I want to challenge you jot down some of the things that offend you in these few moments that we have together. I'll give you about 90 seconds to do that. I didn't have it on. I want you to acknowledge that these inventories can give you a lot of confidence in the area of your gifting. But one of the things that's also true is that they're tools, right? And they're not scripture, and so you kind of have to consider the source for what it is. And many times the free ones are not very thorough treatments. And so what you may be drawn to do is to maybe you start by taking a free version of an inventory, but you say, you know, I want to drill into this a little bit more. I want to see what else there is to learn about what this inventory says is true of me. And so you go and you make a small investment and you pay for the $35 version or however much it is. And you can also find books that will help you unpack these areas of giftedness. There's some podcasts on Enneagram and gifting, and many of these things, even though and maybe for you, you know, you may sort of receive. Maybe you think about these sort of inventories and you think, wow, you know, unless it's a spiritual gift inventory, it doesn't feel very spiritual, right? Is it okay for me to get a sort of a psychological inventory and to find spiritual application for that? And my personal opinion would be yes, it is. It's a tool that can be used to help shed light on God's spiritual gifting in your lives. And so, but I just wanted you to know there are many, many tools, and sometimes it's worth kind of making the extra investment to learn just a little bit more. Again, there are free podcasts, there are books, there are articles, there are things on the internet that you can find. But you know, try to look for ones that shed sort of that see through, that use these things as sort of a lens to understand what you know, to understand your type and your gifting from a spiritual perspective, if that makes sense. All right, one more activity coming back down to passion that I think you'll find very powerful. And you see in your handout for your Passion 360-degree interview, text people in your life something like the following statement. It encourages you to text 12 people. I think I probably texted 30 people. I was so interested in hearing what people believe my passions are. And I got everything in the responses. I got everything from college football to family to brokenness. But text, you know, for example, maybe 4 family members, 4 coworkers, and 4 others, people who have sort of a 360-degree perspective of your life. Supervisors, people who follow you, who are under your leadership, peers. Text them a statement like this: I am currently participating in a life design process and am seeking input from others. I'm curious what 3 words you would use to describe what I am passionate about in general, and please reply with 3 words only. Okay, so if you ask people for 3 words, they may give you more than 3 words, but if you ask for a short paragraph, you may never hear back from them, right? And so text people in your life this statement, and it's really, and obviously once you type it out, then you can copy and paste it. So that's how you can text up. You know, you can just keep texting other people. But this is really a revealing thing. And as I began to write a lot of these down and to sort of group them together, some of the words were repeated, some similar words were given, and I began to, so part of what we see with like the offender opposites is that's kind of our internal reflection about what we're passionate about. You know, the Passion 360 is sort of an external affirmation of others, of what they see in my life that I'm passionate about. Now, you know, unfortunately, I don't know most of those drivers that we honk at each other on the highway, because I could ask them what I'm passionate about. Maybe they say obstruction is what you're passionate about. I'm saying that jokingly, but text the people who know you best, right? And ask them what they would affirm to be insights in your life. You know, one of the powerful things about this is our lives were meant to be lived out in community, right? And our spiritual lives and our callings were meant to be pursued in community and lived out in community. And so when we text our community, what we begin to see is, or what we begin to realize is that people see things in us that we don't even see, right? Sometimes we have blind spots, whether growth areas or strengths. Sometimes we have hidden strengths that we don't realize. So I think it's actually that way. Blind spots are kind of flaws that maybe we don't see, right? or that we minimize. And then the other sort of hidden strengths. Sometimes we're blind to hidden strengths as well. And so that's the power that this exercise can have. I want to take us into my calling. And again, in a calling exercise, it may seem uh, sort of redundant that we have uh, a part of this that we refer to as calling. But again, I think the arrow is a powerful metaphor, because an arrow without an arrowhead is not an arrow, right? A life calling without some precise, without kind of being drawn to a point, without being narrowed to a one thing that I must do, is not really a calling. And so this is what we aim for. This is what we strive for, is to kind of refine our understanding of what it is that God's designed us and purposed us, impassioned us for. The experiences that He's given us in our stories should begin to ultimately inform our calling. I have to tell you, I don't think this is a particularly helpful exercise. Um, but and I think part of it is because the whole aspect of calling is a mystical thing, right? And it's a very personal thing. And so one exercise that I can give you is sort of this 2-word exercise. And what I want to direct you back to, um, again, I think this is very simplistic. It can be powerful, but what you begin to do when you begin to think about calling is you look back over all of these things that you've written down, over the things that you've learned about yourself, whether that's your chapter titles of your life, whether it's your passions, whether it's words that you circled in your gift inventories. What you begin to realize is that as you write those words out, those words that are most, that are most true of you, then you can begin to distill it into statements that will reveal calling, if that makes sense. And so you're taking all this information you've gathered about yourself, right? You look for those common words that people used in describing your passions. You look for the words that you circled in your inventories. You that describe your gifting. You look for those metaphors, those pictures, those words that jump out from your story. For me, again, it was realizing potential. And so, and then what I encourage you to do, and this is going to be virtually impossible for you to do in this moment unless you've really spent some time thinking about this already, is to kind of narrow it down, to try and capture it in 2 words. And that's a ruthless thing to ask, right? To summarize our whole existence in 2 words. And that's kind of the point, if you will. It's kind of the point, is to distill this into the simplest form. And so, again, for me, Steve Allen exists to honor God and to help others by realizing potential or developing leaders. And you see some examples of this, I think, in your handout. Here we go. You see on the last page, at the top of the page, for example, you see Will. Will exists to honor God and help others by applying essence. And Will have to explain to you what that means, because I have no idea what that means. Susan exists to honor God and help others by designing enjoyment, right? And that may not sound very spiritual, but Susan knows that about herself. And so maybe Susan is the person in the life of the church who is most gifted in the area of designing community building activities, of envisioning community building activities in the life of the church. Drew exists to honor God and to help others by empowering momentum. And so for him, that probably in the life of a church might involve equipping others to serve, so that the church can have a powerful impact in its community. And this is what calling's all about, right? It's about impact. What is that point of impact that best describes your life? And I think it's distilling it to 2 words, the first of which is an action word ending in ing, can kind of help you begin to think, to take all those other things and to, again, you're taking all those words that you begin to feel are true about yourself, and you're trying to distill them to the 2 most true words. And one of them is an action word, and the other word is kind of that precision point. Again, for me, it's developing potential or realizing potential. Chad's is nurturing strategy. Williams is making connections. Mary's is restoring value. Okay? And again, I totally realize that in a really short session together, you're not going to be able to accomplish this, right? This is going to take this is like a 4-session retreat, a 6-session retreat that you do like in 4 quarters. And so I don't expect you to be able to capture all of this in this moment. But does this sort of make sense, at least what we're striving for? You know, I don't know if you've ever taken one of those forced choice. Most inventories are forced choice, right? You have to either choose this word, or you have to say somewhere between a 1 and a 5, right? It's a forced choice. It's ruthless. It's really, really trying to steer you into a precise understanding of it. That's what this is about. It's sort of a forced choice. It's if I had to stake, you know, if I had to, my seminary professor once said to me, he was talking about the life of Martin Luther. You know, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses about the Catholic Church to the doors of the church at Wittenberg, and he was critiquing the organization that was the religious and ruling organization of his day. And he was summoned to the Council of Marburg, right? And to give a defense of why he did that, why he publicly critiqued the church by nailing these 95 Theses for all to read. And when asked why he did this, he said, "Here I stand. I can do no more." And there comes a time in all of our lives. My seminary professor, history professor at Southwestern Seminary, once said this. He was sharing with us. He was kind of summarizing what we had been reading about Martin Luther, and he was describing his time at the Council of Marburg. And he's looking down, and all of a sudden he takes off his glasses, and he says, "Young men and young women," he says, "there comes a time in every one of our lives where we have to draw the line and stand and fight and maybe die." He puts his glasses back on and looks back down at his page, and he says, "Don't draw the line in stupid places. Don't draw the line in stupid places." So that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying this. But you know, where will you draw the line? You know, that's what this is all about. You know, a line is a very narrow thing. A calling, I don't want to make it sound as though a calling can't take many, many expressions. But what is the most powerful aspect of calling? What is the tip of the spear of your calling? What is the line that you draw that says, this is where standing and fighting and dying for in my life? That will reveal, that'll shed some light on the tip of the spear, the tip of the arrow for you and your lives. I want to direct us to the goal. And this is where you're going to spend the rest of your time. And you can circle back through anything that we've shared with the remainder of this time. In fact, you may find that most useful. But I want to direct your attention to the final page of your handout. And this is, again, the bullseye the intended point of the impact for the arrow, the goal, realizing the goal to which we're called, right? And in so many words, and I've even put in your handout per this retreat, your goal, and maybe you would word it differently, but your goal is clearly understanding God's divine design for your participation in God's glory. How will God get glory from your life? How will God get the most glory from your life? How will you discover God's best? That's the bullseye. And so I've given you, again, an exercise, a Venn diagram on that final page that hopefully will begin to calibrate your focus upon a specific point of impact. And that's sort of the overlap of these circles of this Venn diagram. What's the intended point of impact of the launched arrow that we see revealed in as we focus upon God's calling? And so we have 3 circles. And this kind of goes back to that first quote by George Barna, right? Here we go. It kind of goes back to that first quote of George Barna. And when we think about the sweet spot or the bullseye of our calling, that has to do with passion, has to do with ability, and it has to do with opportunity. And so, you know, again, your passion is, what is that thing that you care about most? Your ability is, what do you do best, right? And I don't know, maybe you're like me. Usually when I ask what I do best, I'm kind of like, man, my gifts are so behind the scenes. My gifts are not usually standing up in a very visible way and leading. My gifts are more sort of a Barnabas sort of gifting. It's helping others succeed. And so that's been kind of the hallmark of my ministry. It's sort of a behind. And so it may be a very difficult thing for you to come to a point of understanding, what is it that I do best? And so ask other people, what do I do best? And then that third circle is opportunity. Where is your greatest impact? Where's your greatest impact? I think, and I didn't put it either in your outline or in this presentation, but opportunity refers to, I believe, arenas, influence, and measures. And here's what I mean by that. Opportunity. When we look at that third circle of the Venn diagram, where is my greatest impact? That refers to arenas in which you live. Your home, your work, your study, your play. So the arenas or the areas, and I used an A word there. You'll find out here in just a second why. But what are the arenas in which you live? Because that's going to reveal to you what your opportunity is for living out your calling. Next is influence. What is the influence that you have in your life? And this is going to grow out of your story, because it's going to be your experiences, right? As you look back and you tell your story and you articulate your story for yourself, I encourage you, once you kind of get your 6-sketch storyboard together, share it with someone. Maybe you share it with someone else in this room so that you can kind of exchange stories. But sort of practice telling it and see if it rings true to you, and see if you get good at telling your story. But you'll begin to see that the experiences that surface in our story are a part of the influence that God has given us. Does that make sense? When you have experience, it's something you're trusted, right? And trust is influence. And so another aspect of influence is season of life, right? And so for some of us, you maybe you've lived long enough that you're trusted to a measure that maybe others might not be, because you lack experience or you lack credibility in some way, or maybe you lack relational depth with that person. And so what's your influence? And then thirdly, what is the measure of opportunity that you have? So AIM, right? AIM, arenas, influence, and measure. What is the measure of your opportunity? And this refers to your platform, your day job, right? Or maybe a role that you serve in the church, or a role that you play in your community, or a role that you play in your family. What is your platform where you're going to live out this calling? What is the exposure that you have? We can't have influence in somebody's life without exposure. And Jesus calls this being salt and light. Salt has to have contact with the lives of others in order to have impact. And then that leads us to the last thing, and that's relational credibility. The measure of our impact has to do with how far we're trusted, how much we're trusted by those around us to lead them and to point them to Jesus and to God's best for their lives. So AIM, arenas, influence, and measure. When you think about where is the greatest impact in your life, I think these are the primary things to consider. And I want to give you the rest of the time, and that's going to be about 20, 25 minutes, because here's what I want to encourage you to do. And I want to bring this I want to kind of bring this down to a kind of culmination. You see the overlap. Oh, by the way, quickly before I get to the sweet spot. So you'll be able to fill in these blanks through some reflection, but also through kind of going back and again, looking at the things that you circled, the things that you said are true about yourself, the things that people say back to you and that they affirm. What can I do best? Or what do I care about most? That will come from internal reflection, some of the things you've already done. It'll come from soliciting external affirmation. It'll come from those things. So capture some of those words in that Venn diagram. And it's really important that you do that. Capture words and phrases and write them into this Venn diagram, because that's going to help us determine and articulate the sweet spot. Okay? Does that make sense? I've tried to make sure this builds, that every part of it builds on the next. And so everything you've done to this point kind of culminates in being able to distill your impressions in this Venn diagram, your passion, your ability, and your opportunity, which will reveal your sweet spot. And this is how we define the sweet spot. I am created to honor God and help others by leveraging my abilities to take words that you've put in your Venn diagram to blank, blank, and blank. Those are your abilities. Those are the things you do best, and blank. With a deep passion for, those are the things that you care most about. A deep passion for blank, blank, and blank. In the ideal context of, that's your opportunity, right? And again, I can't stress how powerful this has the potential to be in your life, and how powerful it can be in narrowing your focus to that one thing, right? That one thing that you must do for the glory of God. I want to share for you, I didn't put it up here, but I'll read for you an example. Here's at least one draft that I'm continually refining of my own sweet spot. So I am created by God I am created to honor God and help others by leveraging my abilities to envision, design, develop, and mobilize with a deep passion for multiplying leaders, mending brokenness, maximizing potential, and mobilizing for movement in the ideal context of innovative collaboration, that's in community, right? Challenge engagement, and missional formation and urban impact. So I am created to honor God and help others by leveraging my abilities to envision, design, develop, and mobilize with a deep passion for multiplying leaders, mending brokenness, maximizing potential, and mobilizing for movement in the ideal context of, that's my opportunity, right? Innovative collaboration, challenge engagement, and missional formation and urban impact. And so that's a lot of words, right? And it doesn't have to mean a whole lot to you. It's meaningful to me. It gives words to something that I feel at my core, that wakes me up early in the morning and it keeps me up late at night. And so that's the sweet spot for you. That's an illustration of the sweet spot for you. I want to give you the rest of the time. Pastor Garrett's going to kind of call us to a close here at about 8:30, 8:25, 8:30, and we'll conclude our time together. But the rest of the time is yours. And so use this time to gather your impressions and to try to distill them and narrow them so that you can put them into this Venn diagram and find that overlap that leads to targeting your sweet spot. And again, ask questions if you have them. I'll come around and try to be helpful.